a big and heavy week for many of us here in this sector. The funding freezes and executive orders over the last 9 days have caused a lot of uncertainty in the sector and for people in communities around the United States and the globe. We do believe that high quality listening and feedback is not a distraction, but really is core to the work that we're doing to responding to the uncertainty of this situation. And we certainly hope that this webinar can provide practical ideas of how you can keep the needs of communities at the heart of your work central to your response. So thank you to everyone for joining us here today. Our goal today is to introduce you to the core principles of high quality listening and feedback. So this is a guide to what it looks like for both nonprofits and philanthropy to listen well to the people at the heart of their work. That's the people most affected by the programs and decisions. These principles are the brainchild of a group called the Irritants for Change. You'll see many of their logos here. This is a collaboration between leading nonprofit platforms like Candid, Charity Navigator, BBB Wise Giving Alliance, as well as a number of feedback experts. Updating the core principles was a collaborative effort that involved input from many people. And our goal today is to bring them alive for you and for your work. So we will start here with the agenda just to give you a sense of what we'll be going over in the next about an hour that we have here. So we will start with the panel, followed by a Q&A and some inspiring stories about how the principles can transform both grant maker and nonprofit listening and practices. I really encourage you all to put your questions in the chat throughout the panel. We'll have an opportunity as I said, to really dive into the questions that you have. We also had a number of questions come in ahead of time. So as they come up, feel free to add them to the chat. We'll make sure to go through them. And first, we wanted to start with a poll question, an icebreaker poll. So it wouldn't be, feedback related work without asking you a little bit about your feedback. So you'll see a number of Muppet GIFs here. And we'll just ask which of the Muppets on this slide best represents high quality listening and feedback in your work. So think about that. We'll be using Poll EV. And so you should see a poll here. Yeah, exactly. So you can answer the poll in this either on your phone or in your browser. We have here the Poll EV link. Yeah, we'll continue getting those votes in. Awesome. Oh, there we go. Professional Kermit. Yeah, the link is in the chat. It's that pollev.com/FBL524. Ooh, panicking beaker. Oh, Professional Kermit is coming back from the lead. Thanks to everyone who's filling this out, letting us know how you feel. Awesome. All right. So, all right, pretty good. We have still answers coming in. So a lot of people here. It looks like we have some professional Kermit, some strong Miss Piggy here, letting us know. It seems like people are feeling pretty strong. We have some weary folks. Luckily, not too many panicking people, but a few are in here. We're excited to sort of speak to all of this. Hopefully you can all find something of value in this webinar here. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll, turn off the slides just for a moment, and move really into our panel. I'm really excited for the folks who are joining us today. As I said, we're starting with a panel. I'm going to pass it along to my co-speakers to introduce themselves. So first, Mei Chang from Candid. Mei, can you just quickly introduce yourselves? We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. So delighted to be here. I'm Mei Chang, CEO of Candid. Been at Candid a little over 3 years.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'll then pass it to Valerie Threlfall. If you could just introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm the Executive Director of Listen for Good, a feedback capacity building program that works in the United States. We were started in 2016. I've been here since the beginning, and we've worked with 1,000 organizations around the country.
Great. And finally, I will pass it to Art Taylor to introduce himself and to get our panel discussion started.
Well, hello everyone, Art Taylor. I am the president and CEO of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance, where I've been for almost 24 years, if you can believe that. And I want to just kick the panel off by starting with Ann May and just asking, why do platforms like Candid, why are you so invested in encouraging nonprofits and grant makers to listen?
It's a great question, Art. Candid is a data-driven nonprofit ourselves, and as such, we really believe strongly at our core in the value of data, in the importance of transparency, and in ultimately maximizing our impact. And so listening to and acting on constituent feedback touches on all of these, because ultimately, as mission-driven nonprofits, what we're trying to do is achieve the greatest impact possible. And if you think about if you think about for-profit companies, they have it easy because they have a built-in feedback loop based on whether their customers decide to buy their products and services. It's a lot more complicated than the social sector because the people who are paying are often different than the people who were trying to benefit. And so that feedback loop is, a three-way loop, and it's much more complicated. And so that's where we need to be a lot more intentional. And I know that because of that, assessing feedback often can feel overwhelming. And we often set such a high bar that it's harder for smaller nonprofits to participate. We think of, having to do like a randomized controlled trial or some really robust study in order to really understand what's working and not. And the reality is, for smaller organizations, the most effective way of assessing our impact can often be simply to ask the people that we're trying to benefit and to understand, whether what we're doing is working for them. At the end of the day, we can all listen. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be complicated. And it gives us immense insight into what we're doing, and helps us test our assumptions about if what we're doing is meeting people's needs.
Yeah, thanks, Ann May. So Val, how do the core principles help nonprofits and grant makers listen to their constituents?
Yeah, so the purpose of the principles is really to align on what are some of the key best practices and what it looks like to listen well to the people who are most affected by our work. And we created there was an initial creation of the version of the principles back in 2018. And I think they were driven a lot by why we think feedback's important. And then since that time, more and more things have come to light. So for example, we have new evidence about the relationship between feedback and outcomes. We have also kind of an increased conversation around the role that equity plays in high quality listening and feedback. And both of these have we wanted to kind of take into account these new insights and update the principles. So for example, 2 years ago, Feedback Labs, Listen for Good, and a third-party evaluator looked at hundreds of data from nonprofits that had participated in Listen for Good and was able to do a research project where we looked at which practices are really correlated with nonprofits that would actually be making changes based on feedback. So it was an opportunity for us to say which practices and processes are really most important, which ones are really leading to organizational change and better outcomes for clients. And so we updated the principles so that we could incorporate all these and hope that they're getting even more tangible over time and practical while still capturing really the original goal of helping to elucidate how nonprofits and grant makers can redistribute power and also gain insights from the people at the heart of their work.
Great. So Val, can you give us an example of a practice or practices that research found were particularly important?
Yeah.
And how were they reflected sort of in the core principles?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that came out from the research was certainly technical components mattered. So all feedback practices are not created equal. So it's important to be thinking about strong data collection practices, also thinking about how you analyze the information that you get back. These are really important. But one of the things that really came through was also that being participatory and creating participatory feedback processes was really highly correlated with better outcomes. So engaging clients in helping to look at designing a feedback effort. What are you going to be getting? How are you going to be gathering that information and input? And then engaging clients in the sense making was really important. And this is really reflected in Principle 6. I believe we've just chatted in the principles. And, so this idea of making feedback processes participatory and engaging is something that really came through the research.
Well, it's clear that high quality listening and feedback processes make clear how input will be used. And when you involve constituents in designing those processes and interpreting what's heard, it definitely leads to a better outcome for an organization. But Britt, I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, give us a little bit more of another example of a principle that is really practical. Maybe speak a little bit to Principle 4, protecting constituents.
Sure. So, I mean, we really work to make sure all of these core principles of high quality listening and feedback are practical for your work. Just to highlight one, number 4, protect constituents. This essentially is saying that high quality listening and feedback processes are safe for constituents. So it ensures that their confidential information is protected and they aren't put at risk of repercussions by participating in your feedback related processes. I think this one is a really important one. Globally, we're seeing a shrinking civil space, and the fear of repercussions for negative feedback is significant, and it's very real for many people and communities. This can be a fear for life and safety for some in some places in the world, or it could be as immediate as an individual worrying about losing a benefit from a certain nonprofit or social program. So if one of your participants is concerned that providing negative feedback might cause them to be cut from a program or a benefit, particularly as there are, if there are increasingly limited resources, even the fear of being deprioritized in environment, they're unlikely to be open with their input. And so it's both for you to be able to get valuable input and also for very real safety and sort of benefit reasons, this protecting constituents core value is really important to prioritize.
Yeah, it's really sad that we have to protect people in this way, but I think we were wise to include that particular principle in there to protect people so that we can do our work and also keep them in the forefront of our concerns. I just wanted to talk a bit about Principle 5 because obviously high quality listening and feedback can lead to continuous reflection, learning, and improvement. And in my specific example, I'd like to just point to our organization's work setting standards to help organizations demonstrate their trustworthiness. And one of the ways we go about that is by gathering feedback from the donating public via surveys that we produce on an annual basis. We do a large public survey to assess the extent to which people trust organizations across a broad spectrum of ideas. And this really does go a long way in informing our work. And in fact, we're now in a process of revising our standards as a result of some of the feedback that we've gotten from various constituents, including organizations that use the standards and the donating public that relies on the work that comes out of the standards. So those are two ways in which the feedback that we get actually helps inform our work. I wanted to also just maybe turn it back over to you, Britt, to kind of take us to the next place with this discussion, although there may be some questions that we want to get to as well. I'm not sure how we want to go from here, Britt.
Sure. I mean, I'd love to hear also from Mei just which principle you think is particularly important as well.
Thanks, Britt. If I can pick two, One of the things that I really am excited about with these updated set of principles is this increased focus on action and accountability and essentially closing the loop on the feedback. Think of that as not only how we listen, but what we did as a result. And so the two I'd call out are number 3, commit to action, and number 7, which is reporting back to constituents. Because I strongly believe that when we ask people to take the time and energy and risk to provide feedback, we have a responsibility to respect and value that feedback by acting on it. And I think this applies across the board. For example, at Candid, every quarter we ask our employees for their feedback about, working at Candid, and we're asking them to take their time and energy to share their feedback, and we follow that up by sharing back with them what we heard and what we're going to do about it. And I think it shouldn't be any different when it comes to listening to our constituents as nonprofits. In fact, I would argue that it's worse to ask for feedback and just let it sit on a shelf somewhere than to not ask for feedback at all. So similar to how we handle our staff surveys, I think Principle 7 encourages us to close the loop by letting people know what we heard. And Principle 3 encourages us to take action based on what we heard. Because when we act on feedback, that drives a virtuous cycle of improvement so that our interventions continue to improve and achieve greater impact over time.
Great. Thanks so much. I just want to thank everyone who's putting some comments and questions in the chat. We're going to get to storytelling in just a second, but just to address, Dina asked a question talking about Principle 4, protect constituents. How can you best communicate that to how can you best communicate to communities? They'll be protected. They might be skeptical at first, especially if they haven't been part of a feedback process. This also echoes some questions that we got ahead of time. So thanks for articulating that here, Dina. There's a number of things you can do, and I'll also open it up to the other presenters if they have comments, but building trust. So part of it is really people being able to see time over time what happens with the feedback that they're getting. There are things you can do around creating space between decision makers and people asking questions. That could be using a third-party anonymous software or other ways that to ensure that the things people say are not easily identifiable with them by the people who are providing the services or providing the benefits directly or making those decisions. I want to see if Valerie and Mei or Art have any other things they want to add to this first question.
Well, what I would add is it's a great way to listen to understand how much you're trusted by your constituents.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only an opportunity to help people and to protect them, but it's also an opportunity for you as an organization to really get a sense of how deeply embedded in your community are you, because they'll let you know if you're not getting the responses. It means that you got work to do to really bring your community into your work in such a way that they trust you. So I would argue that, and you're going to learn what those things are pretty quickly if you're not getting the feedback that you want to get.
I think one thing I would add, Britt, you mentioned it takes time to build trust. So the first time out the gate, you maybe aren't gonna, it's gonna take some time. But as you said, really showing people the spirit of why you're gathering the feedback, how you're using it, and really having that transparency will build trust over time. And then one of the things we often coach organizations is when you're collecting information to think it's both how you message that. It's really not just what platform are you going to use, but it really is a combination of how are you setting this up? Are you being explicit that their information is, confidential or anonymous? How are you using this? You have to explicitly say this is not to be used punitively. You have to really be open about that, and then also think about what the right administration approaches or ways of engaging people are, given the context that you're in.
I would also, real quick, this is also a place where the dreaded diversity word must be used, because I think it's really important to have people in your organization who can see themselves in the constituents that you're trying to serve. I think that also goes a long way in building trust.
Yeah, Thank you
And
all for those. Yeah, go ahead,
I'm
Anne.
just going to add one minor
Sure.
additional thought, which is that I think one other way that we can build trust is not only ask for feedback after the fact, like we've designed something, we've deployed something, and then we ask for feedback about how it is, but to engage communities upfront in the design so that they have a sense of ownership over what is being created and deployed.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. Please, those of you in the chat, continue to add your questions. We'll get back to that. And next, I'd love to turn it over to Mari Kuraishi, president of the Jessie duPont Fund and a member of the Irritants for Change, to share a little bit about this work and how the principles affect the work that she's doing.
Thank you, Britt. As Britt mentioned, I am the head of the Jessie duPont Fund, and I want to share a story about, actually, and Mei gave me the perfect segue, which is to listen to people in the design of a process. And this really, I think, goes to core principle 1 around how high quality listening and feedback share power with the people most affected by our work. So this is a story. Obviously, we're a foundation, we're a funder. So we hold quite a bit of power in the form of dollars and influence and decision-making processes. But here in Jacksonville, Florida, community members have been advocating for a creation of a park in a neighborhood called La Villa, a historically African American neighborhood that grew from a Union Army encampment being based there in the Civil War, because a lot of freed enslaved people have been part of the Union Army serving in the Jacksonville area. When the war was over, they came back to Fort Hatch, which became the origin of La Villa. So it became an incredibly bustling and important powder town. It was right near the train station, had at one point the highest concentration of restaurants, hotels, brothels, bars, you name it, it was in La Villa. Fast forward so many decades, highways came through the center of La Villa. Both I-95 and I-10 go right through the middle of La Villa. And then, you know, the story that's true in many other neighborhoods, urban renewal, buildings became dilapidated, they were razed. And so by the time I showed up in 2019, the neighborhood is largely empty. But the advocates of La Villa's history have been saying we need a park there to commemorate the Johnson brothers. And the Johnson brothers were the people who composed and wrote the song Lift Every Voice and Sing. Many of you are familiar with it. It became the Black national hymn in the middle of the civil rights movement. And you've probably heard it at some NFL games. Anyway, those brothers grew up, and lived in Jacksonville. So we wanted a park. And we did two things as a foundation. We, one, advocated for the selection of an urban landscape designer, Walter Hood, MacArthur award-winning designer, who took the task of designing a park in memory of the Johnson brothers very seriously. He did incredible historical research. And then we, as a foundation, made sure that we tried to gather feedback. Now, as I mentioned, the neighborhood's empty. There are no residents there anymore because of urban renewal. So we had to actually figure out how to reach the descendants of the people who used to live in that neighborhood, to try and make sure that their input was entered into the design of this park. So it was a really elaborate process trying to figure out who we should gather feedback from. I mean, we did the usual thing of sort of saying, we're building a park. Let us know what you think. But we also had to very intentionally track down people who we thought would, and to do so, we hired basically the former founding director of a museum in that neighborhood who had gone around to neighbors and former residents to get archived materials for the neighborhood. And she literally told us, okay, these are the families you need to be in touch with to get their input. And it wasn't very quantitative, but it is something that required a great deal of intentionality, basically. And the park is up and running today. It has become a place that many people choose to hold events there because it is, one, so beautiful, but also two, because it is designed in a way that sort of touches on the chords of memory that so many people have in the city. But in some ways, the sort of the built environment that used to capture those memories disappeared, and we were able to sort of recreate some elements of it. So I think we worked really well together with the city. We worked well with the advocates who have been working for the park. But I think it was, the fact that we chose to direct our funding to that listening process was an intentional one, and I think it led to ultimately better design.
Thank you so much, Mari. That was such an interesting story, and I echo many in the chat who said that they're from Jacksonville or Florida and didn't know that history. So we also learned a little bit there. For our next sort of story here, would love to introduce and welcome Michelle Hughes, the co-executive director of the National Young Farmers Coalition. Michelle was also a 2023 feedback champion. So excited to hear her share her work.
Thanks, Britt. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks for making time and space for me in this call today. So my story relates to principle number 2, for those of you that are familiar with the new core principles. This one is based on high quality listening and feedback that centers the voices of people who are least heard. And I think I'm just going to say a little bit about what that means to me and how this core principle has been implemented at the National Young Farmers Coalition by some work that I've done in the past that Feedback Labs has actually really helped me move forward. So to me, listening to people that are least heard mostly means designing high quality listening and feedback mechanisms in a way that are actually accessible to those people who are generally historically marginalized, and prioritize hearing and acting on that feedback from people who may have given feedback in the past, but there hasn't been any actual action taken based on the feedback that they've given. So my work focuses primarily on underrepresented farmers. So for us, that's young farmers under the age of 40, folks in their first 10 years of farming, particularly Black and brown farmers. And I think for me, this core principle is really important because I see it as kind of the only way to address histories of and legacies of inequity. I work very closely with the Department of Agriculture, who has a documented history of inequity with farmers. And so it's just very important to us that we uplift those who have been most marginalized, because at Young Farmers, we believe that will uplift us all as a farmer coalition. So to tell you a little bit more about the Young Farmers Coalition, we use Young Farmers as shorthand. We're a grassroots organization. We are quite big tent these days, but we are a grassroots organization that aims to shape policy at the federal level and ensure that those policy changes turn into actual material support for our next generation of working farmers. When I started at Young Farmers in 2017, I was Young Farmers' first fellow. These days we have between 50 and 100 fellows at a time. So when I started, I was a hog farmer, and the coalition wasn't very diverse, but it did feel like the only organization that had a political home for me. At the time, I was leaving farming because I faced many of the challenges that a lot of our young farmers and farmers fellows face today. And I sort of worked to become a pillar of the young farmers community through organizing policy and advocacy efforts that I had been leading with our team at the time, and many young farmers that I had developed relationships with in the community. And I realized that the organization was helping young farmers effectively, but more so like the mainstream community of young farmers that you might imagine. So for those of you that don't work with a lot of young farmers, the farming community is generally older white folks. The average age of a farmer is about 58 in most states, 57 at the national level. So young farmers are a little bit of a smaller population, but they are much more diverse than the larger population of farmers that exist in the US. So the work that we were doing was helpful to farmers generally, but it wasn't really reflective of the diversity of the young farmer population that I have grown to know and love over the past 5 or 6 years. So that inspired me to start an organizational change effort that we then called the Racial Equity Transformation at Young Farmers. That started with a racial equity impact assessment. So we used surveys, one-on-one interviews, and sort of like town halls and forum environments to collect feedback from our staff, our organizational partners, and our young farmer network to better understand and document their needs. The vision that young farmers would like to see for the future is one where farming is free of racial violence, accessible to communities, oriented towards environmental well-being, and prioritizes health over wealth. So, I mean, I say that with knowing that the reality is that that is actually really not the case for many farmers, especially young Black and brown farmers don't really operate in that environment, but it is what we are working towards. And I thought that hearing their experiences at the time firsthand would help us change the focus of our organization. So through that work, I leaned on a lot of personal relationships that I had already built with folks in the young farmer community, both on our staff, other partner organizations, and in the farmer community. Many of us are farmers who are former farmers who work in these environments. And this work took place in 2020, between 2020 and 2023. And I really tried to collect the most honest feedback that I could. And I was lucky that I had those relationships that made people feel comfortable to be honest with me about their experience. And we chose farmers that we knew would give a spectrum of feedback. So we tried to shy away from folks who had like only really good experiences with young farmers. We tried to tap into people who had a lot of different experiences, whether they were a fellow, served on a committee, just a member of young farmers. So we use that infrastructure to compile a list of about 25 farmers and partner organizations that we would interview and document in the form of a report. So we did eventually produce a report called the Accountability Report that kind of summarizes all of the work over the 3 years that I mentioned taking place. And I will say that acting on some of that feedback was quite difficult. For some people, it was very easy. For other folks at my organization, it was hard. We were pushing people and forcing them to have an analysis of racial equity that they really just hadn't been expected to, or it was a muscle they hadn't really worked or developed in the past. And so there was a lot of harm that happened, I would say, between the like flooding of new Black and brown farmers coming into the center fold of our organization and the folks who had been running our organization the same way for the past 6 or 7 years of its existence. And so it took us a while. It was a learning experience to kind of get to a place where we all could actually work together towards the same goal without causing harm to each other. But there was a period where we just had to be comfortable with mistakes and apologizing and sort of working through that. I worked with at the time we had 10 program directors at Young Farmers. So I worked with them to make changes based on the feedback that we were getting. So we did a redesign of many of our programs. We offer all sorts of advocacy training, in-person events, gatherings, and both in-person and virtual now. So we changed a lot of the way that we did that work to make sure that their feedback was actually being implemented into our strategic design. And that took most of 2021 to revamp the organization and a little bit of 2022 as well. So as I mentioned, we published some key elements of the feedback in the accountability report and the actions that we took afterward, because we felt that transparency was really important to our process. You know, you'll learn from feedback labs and the feedback cycle that it's important to report back to the people who are giving you feedback. They were very central to the process of the creation of the accountability report as well. So when that came out, they were really excited to see themselves featured and felt like it was kind of an airing out, honestly, of the organization. And some of the things that they had maybe said one-on-one were finally put on the website for everyone to know and understand. And, you know, it landed well with some people and not so great with others, but that was just the risk that we had to take at the time. So it really allowed us, I guess, in summary, it allowed us to make a better organizational commitment to acting on the feedback and pivot our work to center Black and brown farmers in our work, as opposed to continuing to do work that we thought was effective, but was only effective for the mainstream group of young farmers that were in our coalition. So anyway, I think that's what I have to share, and happy to answer any questions if people have them later on.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, so much for sharing that and for being so open about the sort of journey you went on and what you got. We just put a link in the chat with more about Michelle's story and Young Farmers, National Young Farmers Coalition. So please check that out. We have a little time for questions. We got a lot in the chat, so we'll go ahead and start with that. I think we'll spotlight the speakers here. I'm going to start us off with one of the first questions we got from Louisa at Adidas Foundation. She asks about the participation principle. I wonder if some of the speakers have an example or a tip on how to make the feedback participatory in the case of foundations supporting organizations without burdening the organizational team. And she clarified she's asking about organization funder relationship, but I will invite the speakers to open that up to also to other types of feedback. And I'm going to first turn this over to Mari as our foundation head to start, and then if anyone else has other things to add. So Mari, any thoughts on that question from Louisa?
Yeah, so Louisa, I think, you know, when a grantee says we want to design in listening into the process, it's part of the proposal that we, you know, we generally fund things like that, of course. But sometimes, even if money were available, they don't have the bandwidth. So there are actually a number of cases where we as a funder say, with their permission, we're going to be the ones to do the surveying and the communication back to those who are surveyed. So, and you know, for our part, it gives us much greater visibility into the context in which the work is being done. So it's a net plus for us. I don't know that every funder is in a position to do that actual listening, and maybe not every grantee is comfortable with the funder doing that listening. So there's pluses and minuses, of course, on each side. But I think it's really helpful if you, as a grantee, kind of bring that to the agenda in the discussion with the funder.
Thanks. Anyone else want to add something else to that question? All right.
I would just say the Center for Effective Philanthropy does, I forget the name of it, they do feedback from nonprofits to their
Grantee
funders.
perception report.
Thank you. I couldn't remember the exact name of it. And so there is something like that that exists. That is, I think, a kind of gold standard for that, and it can be benchmarked. But I think with any kind of place where we're asking for feedback, making it as simple as possible is really helpful. I think a lot of times we ask for more details than we're able to act on. And I think that's, we just need to make it as simple as possible. And I think the other thing is in the cases where you do need to make it more complex, like you want an in-depth interview, you're trying to get more qualitative data, funders can pay nonprofits for their time to do that. And I think that is a sign of respect as well.
Thanks for adding that, Anne-May, and we just put a link to the grantee perception report in the chat. Next, I'll turn to a question from Megan Lovelace. How important is quantitative data when looking at how you all fund organizations? Do you weigh qualitative data the same way? And then maybe, not to call on someone, but to call on someone, Val, if you want to maybe take a first stab at that, unless anyone else wants to go first.
Yeah, and then this is in the context of funders listening.
I think so. Megan, if you want to clarify in the chat, please do as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're big believers in that both quantitative and qualitative information are very helpful. In general, quantitative data, and actually just picking up on some of the prior comments that were made by Anne May and Michelle, quantitative data can also be especially useful when it can be provided in a context of a benchmark. That's one of the things that makes it extra useful. But you really can get insights from both, and the quantitative data can often shine a light on where there might be a problem, and then qualitative methods can really be used to go deeper. And when Michelle was talking about her really just powerful journey, it made me think about some of the work that we do. We tend to do more survey-based work, but where you gather feedback in the case of trying to amplify voices that it might be least heard, you can gather feedback from a broad swath of the community and then use quantitative methods to kind of cut that data and look and see if people are having different experiences with your organization based on their identity. And that's a really powerful way that we've seen at Listen for Good organizations get very quick insights about how they can continuously improve their services and make them more effective. So that's just a starting answer. So big believers in both.
Anyone else want to add something? Awesome. Let's move to a question from Katie Ross. So she says, usually the hardest folks to get to answer surveys are the ones who are having the worst experience and are having the least transformative time. How do we work to get those non-responders to engage? And this might be one I'd love to hear from Michelle, if you can share some thoughts from your work.
Yeah, sure. So the story that I just shared in the process we went through was time-based, but since then we have learned that having surveys and feedback mechanisms ready for when people are actually trying to give you feedback can be really helpful. So I don't know. I mean, I think in my experience, people who are having like a really hard time, they might be giving you feedback as they're like complaining about what's happening without realizing that they might be answering the questions to your surveys. So we have like open forms now for folks who work with farmers directly. When farmers are on a call and they start saying they had a bad experience with a meeting with a member of Congress or a meeting with a staff member of ours or a partner organization, my staff are, the field organizers are now trained to just immediately say, would you mind if I just take some notes on this so that we can collect it as part of like a larger feedback strategy for the organization. So I just try to collect feedback in real time when it's like organically happening, as opposed to being like, hey, we've decided to do this survey now for this month, and can you find some time to do that? Because farmers often, they talk to us when they want to, not when we ask them to, and especially not during the growing season. So I spend a lot of time just trying to collect feedback in like a really organic way instead of trying to create a mechanism or infrastructure and then having people try to like acclimate to that. I try to just get it to happen naturally.
Thanks for that. I also thanks to Sherilyn Horsack, who added a comment in the chat, which you can see as well. Peer advice here. This next question I might ask over to Art. How do nonprofits deal with competing priorities such as those of unions that their workers belong to? Thanks, Susan, for that.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Well, we're in a world now where we used to say that if a nonprofit was paying its executives too much, that was an ethical issue for the nonprofit. Today, we're in a world where we say if nonprofits aren't paying their employees throughout the organization fairly, that's an ethical issue. And so when you think about priorities in unions, we would hope that organizations would engage in the kinds of activities that would lead to employees feeling satisfied, fairly compensated, and that any issues that unions would have around working conditions and others would be met. However, if those things are not met, this is a great way for organizations to engage employee unions in helping them understand what they can do better for employees and how they can come together to make sure that employees are getting what they need to help the organization truly fulfill its mission while taking care of those employees. So that's just a general thought that I have on that. While I have the floor, Britt, if I could, I'd like to offer one other comment about the question of whether quantitative and qualitative feedback really works. Years ago, I was leading a job training program that did really well in a youth intervention. We did a randomized control study that showed that kids who were in our program did far better than those who weren't. And then we tried to scale it to other locations. And what we discovered was that these other locations weren't doing as well as the initial location. And we wanted to try to understand why. And it wasn't really until we started asking some of the participants that we understood the difference was in the quality and commitment of the people engaging them. This is something that probably would never have come out had we not begun asking those students what was it that they really understood that was so different about their experience. And it was those teachers and what their commitment was and how they were always available to them. This didn't come out in any of the other metrics that we were capturing on a quantitative basis. So you can see that the two really work well together. You can find out things through this qualitative approach that you might not see in the numbers. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that valuable addition. We're getting close on time, so I'm going to ask one last question over to Ann May, and this is from Anna Zimmerman. In any feedback cycle, you receive some feedback that your organization chooses to or is not able to act on, or chooses to and is able to act on, and some that it may not be able to or may not be willing to act on. How should this be respectfully handled in reporting back to constituents?
It's a great question. And for me, it just comes back to transparency. I think what we want to do when we ask for feedback is to reflect back what we heard. And it doesn't mean you have to act on everything. It's going to be impossible in pretty much any circumstance to get feedback and be able to act on all of that feedback. But I think what we want to do is let people know what we heard and then let them know what we are acting on and what we're not acting on, and give them some understanding of why we made those choices and what might cause us to make a different choice. So you're never going to be able to make everyone happy, but what we can do is have a commitment to transparency about why we're making the choices we do and on what basis we're making those choices.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you to Mia, Clara, Dina, Kelly, others whose questions we haven't gotten to in this chat. We'll try to follow up with those as well. We did want to leave a little bit of time for some reflections. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how the core principles are resonating with you. So we have one more poll to close out our webinar here. So we've put a link to the core principles in the chat. You can see them there. We'd love to hear from you which core principle feels most important to your work and why. To answer that question, again, you can go to that pollev.com/FBL524. The link to that is also in the chat. You can answer on your phone, your computer. You can type in a short answer, and your answer will be shown on the screen. So you can go ahead. We hear closing the loop. Number 7. Anything else here resonating with you and your work? Sharing power with the people most affected by your work. Yeah, number 2, centering the voices of people who are least heard. Again, we had a 7, reporting back to constituents, another 7 in the chat. Great, yeah, responding back, sharing power. Lots here about sharing power. Would love to hear anything also in the chat that people want to expound on. Principle number 8, making it systematic. Yeah, so important to share what we hear with others. Centering the voices of people, commit to action. Love that one. We hear a 5 and a 7. So 5 is that leading to continuous reflection, learning, improvement. Yeah, continuously reflecting, learning, systematic. centering the voices of people least heard. Yeah, thanks, Megan, adding the shifting of power, really the next stage there. We have a +1, 2 +1s there in the chat. Yeah, thank you all for sort of sharing that work, what you're thinking. As we wrap up, I hope that you are leaving feeling sort of inspired and equipped to take action to strengthen your listening and feedback practice. So we do have a lot of resources available. The powerhouses on this call have put together a lot of resources here. We've compiled them both for nonprofits and for funders on the pages that we'll put in the chat now. So you can read some case studies and practical how-tos. You can search for a repository of feedback tools, find introductory and in-depth trainings, coaching, connecting with other nonprofit and philanthropic leaders who, like you, recognize how important it is to do a good job of listening to the people at the heart of our work. So we're putting in some chats, some resources here for nonprofits and for funders. For nonprofits, if you want to improve your rating on Charity Navigator and share the story of how you're listening and responding to feedback from people at the heart of your work, I encourage you to fill out the How We Listen section on your Candid profile. Nearly 40,000 nonprofits have shared how they engage with constituents in the How We Listen section of their Candid nonprofit profiles since that came out in 2019. We just put in the chat a link there that you can read more about what that How We Listen section is. Filling out the How We Listen section on your profile demonstrates transparency and a commitment to constituent feedback, and it also feeds into your nonprofit's Charity Navigator rating. For funders, How We Listen can help you understand who is doing high quality feedback, which of your grantees is prioritizing this. So I really encourage you to start conversations with your grantees about how they're listening and what support they want to help them embody all 8 of these core principles. Please note, Candid's been steadily rolling out improvements to nonprofit profiles, and they'll continue to do so in the coming months. So to make room for that work, there may be a brief pause in editability to the How We Listen section starting January 31st. So we encourage you to update that section before then. You can check out improvements at app.candid.org. If you don't remember all of these links and everything I'm saying, don't worry. We'll be sending you an email with links to these resources and others, as well as the recording of this webinar. So I hope you'll reach out to us if we can support you on your feedback journey. And if there are any final questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you so much to our speakers, to our presenters, to everybody who joined us today. We're really grateful for your time in a very busy week, and hope that you find these core principles of high quality feedback and listening helpful. Thank you so much for joining us.